Hello, and welcome to the JCC of Metro Detroit's 69th Annual Jewish Book Fair. My name is Heidi Budai, and I'm Assistant Executive Director of the JCC. It is my pleasure to welcome you on this Sunday morning to our talk with Ruth Behar, author of Letters from Cuba, part of our Mitten Mornings series featuring Michigan authors. This weekend, we are honoring all of our patrons. Their support helps make this event possible, and especially this year, when faced with so much uncertainty, we are deeply grateful for their commitment to Book Fair and to the art of Jewish storytelling. So please join us in thanking our patrons. If you like, you can leave a note of thanks in the comments, or reach out to all of the Book Fair patrons in your life. And while we can't give you, the patrons, the collective round of applause that you deserve, we hope you feel our appreciation for making the virtual book fair a reality this year. The goal of the Detroit Jewish Book Fair is to bring the best new Jewish books and authors from around the world to Metro Detroit. This year, the rooms we're all sitting in may be different, but that purpose remains the same. The book fair runs until December 9th, and we have an exceptional lineup of events planned. To see our full event schedule, learn about ways to support Book Fair, watch events you may have missed, and find our online store, where you can find Letters from Cuba and plenty of other hand-selected books and gifts. Visit our website at culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. This year, in order to provide as much programming to the community as possible, we've made all of our events free of charge. So if you enjoy this and other Book Fair events, please consider becoming a patron or donating to Book Fair. You can do either or both at our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. We rely on community support to make this annual event possible, so thank you in advance for becoming part of the Book Fair family. The Book Fair team would also like to thank all of our sponsors and corporate donors for helping out with Book Fair this year. We have a really special event for you this morning, and we want you to be a part of it. You can ask questions and offer comments in the YouTube comment section below, or by texting the number in the corner of your screen. Our speakers have a great discussion prepared, and they will take as many of your questions as they can. While you're at our YouTube channel, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the reminder bell. That way, you'll never miss any of our exciting events. The focus of today's event is getting to know Ruth Behar, author of Letters from Cuba. Ruth was born in Havana, grew up in New York, lived in Spain and Mexico, and now makes Ann Arbor her home, where she teaches anthropology at the University of Michigan. She was the first Latina to win a MacArthur Genius Grant, and other honors include a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship and being named a Great Immigrant by the Carnegie Corporation. Her most recent book, Letters from Cuba, tells the inspiring story of a young Jewish girl who escapes from Poland to make a new life in Cuba while she works to rescue the rest of her family. Based on Ruth Behar's family history, this compelling story celebrates the resilience of the human spirit. Please join me in welcoming Ruth Behar.
Good morning.
Hi, buenos días.
Buenos días. Muchas gracias para la, ¿cómo se dice, talk? No, my Spanish isn't that great. So welcome this morning. We're so glad to have you as part of our Michigan author series. This is the third in the series. So far, we've heard from a journalist who became a fiction writer. We've heard from an advertising professional who became a fiction writer. And now we have an anthropology professor who also writes fiction. So tell us a little more about yourself and about how you came to write this specific book.
Thank you, Jamie. And I want to thank Heidi for her lovely introduction as well. Well, you know, I think a lot was said in that introduction that I was born in Cuba. That's a very big part of my life. I came to the United States as a child. I was about 5 when we settled in New York. And I think those two factors have always been very, very important for me, that I'm a Jewish woman who grew up speaking Spanish at home and still speak Spanish to my parents, and it's a language that I'm very much at home in. And I recognize both my Ashkenazi background on my mother's side of the family, the Yiddish-speaking side of the family, and then the Sephardic side on my father's, and so of course I have the Spanish language from way back from the whole Sephardic ancestry going back at least to the 15th century, if not before. So I think that's a very important part of my life, even though I primarily live in English in the United States. But I think having those two languages is very, very important. And I think growing up being Jewish and Cuban and Latina and having this mix of identities in the United States really made me the person that I am, and I think it drew me to anthropology. I always wanted to be a writer, but I was very drawn to anthropology as a profession because of the focus on the diversity of cultures and the interest in people's traditions and heritage, and I was very, very drawn to the study of all of those things, and have spent most of my life researching the world of Spanish speakers, whether in Spain or Mexico. I've also spent time living in Argentina, and also, of course, visiting Cuba frequently. So I'm very, very tied to these countries of the Spanish-speaking world, and and it goes back to this double heritage. On the one hand, the Sephardic side; on the other hand, the fact that my four grandparents settled in Cuba in the 20s and 30s, and that they couldn't come to the United States. That's something that people often ask me about. Well, why did they go to Cuba? Why didn't they just come to the United States? And it was because they couldn't come to the United States. There was an Immigration Act passed in 1924 that established quotas on immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. And among those countries included were Poland and Turkey, that were two primary countries from which immigrants went to Cuba. So I also never forget that my family in that earlier era were unwanted immigrants in the United States. And so they had to find an America somewhere else. And they found their first America in Cuba before they found their second America in the United States.
So you mentioned a Yiddish-speaking branch of your family. Did the Sephardic branch of your family speak Ladino or?
Spanish. So it was more like Spanish, but there were enough words and enough usages that were very much in the Sephardic style. And and I've talked to my father and my aunt, his younger sister, about this, and my aunt was telling me that when she was growing up in Cuba, she thought her parents spoke perfect Spanish, and then she said that, but people would tell her, no, they speak with an accent, and I think the accent was that they spoke using words from Ladino, but Ladino was close enough, or is close enough, to Spanish that it was very understandable to Cubans, and I think they gradually changed their Spanish a little bit to make it sound more like Cuban Spanish, but with enough of the sound of Ladino. My grandmother, my Sephardic grandmother, I never forget this. She always called me Rutica. She didn't call me Ruti. The family mostly called me Ruti. Rutica. And I think that Rutica was a kind of Ladino way of saying my name.
It's so interesting. I mean, I think so. I studied Spanish in school. I can understand it much better than I can speak it, and I always find I can pretty much understand Ladino. So I'm always interested about that, like, swerve in and out of languages generally, but especially the relationship between Ladino and Spanish. So it's interesting that your grandparents were able to sort of just swoop into Spanish like that.
Absolutely. And I always thought about that contrast with both sets of grandparents, that my Sephardic grandparents could kind of swoop in, as you say, and and sort of melt into the culture a little bit more easily because of the Sephardic background. And in fact, there were many Turkish Jewish immigrants that went to Cuba precisely, and to Mexico and other Spanish-speaking countries, because they knew they had this, this Espanol, as they called it. They had this Espanol, and they knew that they would be able to communicate with people in those countries. There's an anecdote that I was just reading in a book about a Sephardic immigrant who went to Mexico actually in the same period, and her son was already there, and she arrived in Mexico, and she said, "Oh, is everybody Sephardic? Because they all speak Spanish." So that Spanish background was very important to Sephardic Jews. And when you think about this, they had been in countries of the Ottoman Empire, what then became Turkey and Greece, for example. They had been in those countries for over 500 years after being expelled from Spain, and they still spoke this old Spanish. So it's fascinating. But then on my mother's side, they did speak Yiddish. And so I also grew up hearing Yiddish, hearing my mother's parents speak Yiddish to each other, seeing my grandmother, who the book is inspired by, my grandmother Esther. She was a great reader, and she was always reading the Forward, the newspaper in Yiddish. I mean, I grew up, seeing her always reading the Forward in Yiddish, and she was just, she loved to speak Yiddish and taught me, a couple of words and so on, but I never really learned the language. And with my book, with Letters from Cuba, actually, young Esther in the book, she is technically writing these letters in Yiddish. I mean, I wrote them in English, but I kept thinking to myself, she would have been writing in Yiddish. That was her language. So for my mother's side of the family, it was a little bit more of a challenge to learn Spanish because Yiddish and Polish did not resemble Spanish at all, and they had to figure out how to speak this language literally from scratch.
Yeah, that must be such a tough transition. I mean, as an English speaker, learning Spanish, I mean, I started studying it when I was a kid, so it's hard to remember, but like it's such a different language, right? I mean, they're just not really related.
Yeah.
So from language, I want to shift a little bit to food. So food fit plays a fairly big role in this book, which I should mention is theoretically aimed at, say, 10 to 12-year-olds, but realistically is enjoyable for anyone to read. I read it. I am an adult. I enjoyed it. So recommended to everyone. It really is. It's engaging. It's interesting. It's poignant. It's funny. It's just a great book. So I encourage everyone to check it out. The link is in the chat there to purchase it. So food plays a pretty big role in this book as a way of retaining tradition, as a way of adapting to a new place. So tell us a little bit about the role of food in your Jewish experience, and also what you wanted to convey with putting food so central in this book.
Well, I'm so glad you asked about that, because it's one of my favorite topics to talk about. And, just growing up, it was always interesting to see the variety of cuisines that we had at home. Well, my mother, by the way, is a great cook, and my son has done this wonderful series that I'm just going to plug right now, which is called Nana Cooks. So you can look it up on Facebook, and you'll see my mother cooking various Cuban dishes, and my son Gabriel has been filming her for quite some time, and it's great because she's a wonderful cook, and she has learned how to kosherize all of these classic Cuban dishes that we all love. So she'll make tamales with chicken rather than with pork. My mother uses a lot of chicken in her dishes. And so wonderful tamales, tamal en cazuela, which is kind of like a stew form of tamales rather than the sort of tamal packets that we're used to. It's a very, very Cuban kind of root dish that she makes with chicken rather than with pork. Black beans and rice, which is very Cuban, the frijoles negros, the plantains, the fried plátanos. So all of these dishes, I grew up eating a lot of Cuban food, and the classic also When we first arrived in the United States and we were struggling and my father was working 3 jobs to support us, the classic is white rice with a fried egg over it, and then possibly some fried plantains if you can get that. And then if you have enough, you can also create a picadillo. Picadillo is like what's called sloppy joes, like a ground meat with tomatoes and onions and garlic and so on. So I had all of those kosherized Cuban dishes at home, growing up in New York and Queens. But then, my family liked to go to Cuban restaurants, and there were several of them in New York, in Queens. And one of them, Rincon Criollo, was a restaurant we would go to all the time. And the owners of that restaurant, Creole Corner, Rincon Criollo, they had a restaurant by the same name in Cuba. So they had literally reproduced this restaurant in New York, and we would often go there. But we were not allowed, as kids, we were not allowed to bring any of the food home because, of course, it wasn't kosher. So as long as we ate it in the restaurant, that was okay. But just don't bring it into the house.
That's how you know you're an American Jew.
That's how you know you're an American Jew. And then the other fun fact is that we often went to a Chinese Cuban restaurant in Queens at the time that was called Asia Continental, Asia Continental. And it was a Chinese Cuban restaurant. So you'd get the mix of the Cuban foods plus fried rice, plus egg drop soup, things like that. And that taught me at an early age that if you could be Chinese Cuban, then you could probably be Jewish Cuban too. That there was no problem with mixing these identities, that was okay. So I remember that very, very fondly. And so in Letters from Cuba, I wanted to bring in this whole question of food and how Jewish people negotiate food in new places and try to remain kosher. And so Esther arrives in Cuba, and the first thing that she tastes are these tropical fruits. It's pineapple. She's never had pineapple before, and she's tasting pineapple. Then she tastes a mango, and it's like amazing. But it also happens that in Havana, it happens to be a Jewish bakery already in Havana by the time she arrives in Cuba in the late 30s. And so her father greets her with a challah and bananas. Because those are things they can eat. They can eat a challah from the Jewish bakery, and of course they can have bananas. And that combination, I thought of it very consciously because my maternal grandfather, my Zayde, he was a Russian Jew. And he often told this story that when he arrived in Cuba, all he ate was bread and bananas. Because he wasn't sure what was kosher, but he figured bread was fine and bananas was fine, and that was all he ate. Pan y plátanos, bread and bananas. So I remembered that, and I thought there was something so beautiful about that. A Jewish person trying to figure out what can I have, what can I not have, and starting out with bread and bananas. And so Esther is actually greeted by her father with bread and bananas, and then later they go into the city of Havana and she tries the pineapple. So she's trying these fruits, and there's a lot of pineapple and mangoes and sugarcane in the town where they go to live, because I set the story in a rural town called Agramonte. That's a couple of hours away from Havana, and they go to live there because that's where her father can afford to pay the rent. The rent in Havana is a lot more expensive. And so they go there, and there they subsist on, fruits and actually a lot of rice and fried eggs. That's like, and that comes up several times in the story. It's like we're having our usual dinner of rice and fried eggs. It's very kind of common, working class meal in Cuba. And that's what they're having because they're trying to save up all their money to bring the rest of the family that's waiting desperately in Poland to get out.
And over the course of the book, you see Esther adapt the food she knows to the ingredients she has, which is very much the story of Jewish food, but it's also the story, I think, of food in this country at its best. And it apparently in Cuba as well, like I would not have thought of that, but in New York, in Cuba, like, you know, you have people from all over the world and they don't have quite have the right ingredients. And so they make up something new. I mean, when I lived in Houston, there was a Mexican Vietnamese fusion restaurant that we would go to. That was amazing. And, you know, it was not traditional to either of them, right? It was a real mix. And, you know, that mixing of new ingredients with old recipes, I think it is a good, in the book, it serves as I'm not sure if metaphor is quite the right word, maybe allegory for the way that those identities are mixing that you mentioned earlier, that you had experienced. And I think that's another important theme about in the book is the hyphenization of identity, learning to combine identities. And, you know, we have a question in the comment section about whether there are still Jews in Cuba today and if they're allowed or able to practice Judaism and also, you know, be publicly Jewish.
Yeah. Well, thank you for saying that about the story and the hyphenization, as you said, the fusion and the mixing, and we could talk more about it later. You know, that when they have their Passover Seder, it's kind of a tropical, you know,
Yes.
Seder, because, you know, they're bringing in the foods that are available in Cuba. And at first her father is like, no, but this isn't what we traditionally have. And,
right.
and Esther is like, well, this is what we have here. And they in fact invite friends that they've made, or Esther invites friends that she's
that are
made,
not Jewish.
that are not Jewish, which is
right.
also a big deal because her father is a little wary about doing that. And she's, you know, well, these are our friends because they are the only two Jewish people in this town. And so she feels that she wants to share her culture, and her father is more used to keeping the culture within. So I have that contrast going in the book. But with regard to the question, yes, there is still a Jewish community in Cuba. Actually, in one of my earlier books that's titled An Island Called Home, it's a book about the Jewish community, the current Jewish community in Cuba on the island. And I've been many times to Cuba to research this community and have traveled all over the island, finding Jewish people scattered all over the island, but the majority are in Havana. And I would say there are now about 900 to 1,000 Jewish people still in Cuba. There are 3 synagogues still functioning in Havana. There are Jewish communities in the provincial towns like Cienfuegos and Santa Clara. Santiago de Cuba has its own synagogue as well, all the way on the eastern end of the island. So the community is small, but it's very vibrant. There isn't a rabbi, a full-time rabbi living in Cuba, but rabbis do regularly visit. Now with the pandemic, of course, it's, you know, literally impossible to go to Cuba right now, but you know, up until last year, let's say, it was very common for Jewish American groups to travel to Cuba. And I think groups may have gone with the JCC of Detroit and other places as well. So it's a small community, but a lively and very dedicated community that still lives in Cuba, and that I feel so grateful to them because they are the ones that are maintaining, you know, the spirit of Judaism in Cuba. They are allowed to have a kosher butcher shop. They have a kosher butcher shop in Havana, which is very interesting. It never closed down during the revolutionary period. So Jews feel very comfortable in Cuba. They can maintain their traditions and their customs, and the synagogues, hold religious services weekly, and there is no issue either with the government or with the Cuban people.
Great. That is great to know. And you're right. The JCC J Traveler Department, as it's now called, our travel department, has taken trips to Cuba, and hopefully when this is all over, when we can be in places together again, that we'll continue to do that. We have another question from the audience. Under what circumstances did your family leave Cuba and come to the U.S.? So in the book, we see why they left Eastern Europe, because it was the late 30s, and so how and why did you end up here? I mean, not Ann Arbor specifically. You came to Ann Arbor for a job, but how'd you end up in Queens, I guess?
Well, we left in the early 60s after the Cuban Revolution, after Fidel Castro came to power. Most of the Jewish community left Cuba in that period in the early 60s, largely because Jewish people by that point, by the late 50s, most of them were merchants or they had small mom and pop shops, or they worked as peddlers, but they were all kind of independent entrepreneurs, nearly all. And I mean, they were professionals as well. There were engineers and architects and so on. So there were professionals too, but the majority were in the business, world, and properties were nationalized by Fidel Castro by 1960, 61. Most private property was nationalized, and you couldn't have a private business of any kind. You couldn't even be a street peddler. Even a peanut vendor was no longer allowed to maintain that small private enterprise. And so that was very threatening to the Jewish people that had come in the teens and 20s and 30s and worked so hard to set up these businesses that were then confiscated by the government. So that was one issue. And then the other issue was that in 1961, the government had a literacy brigade. And after that, they were planning to create a public educational system, which was good from many perspectives because there were many young people in Cuba that were illiterate and didn't have good schooling. But most of the Jewish kids were sent to private Jewish schools that the community had created. And they were aware that eventually those schools were going to be shut down. And of course, the country was moving towards secularism and eventually towards atheism. And that was also threatening to many Jewish people. So there was a mass exodus of the Jewish community out of Cuba in the early 60s. And the majority went to Miami, but many also went to New York because in New York, there were more opportunities, more business opportunities, more job opportunities. Miami in the 60s was still kind of a backwater type town. The Cubans like to say this. The Cubans in general like to say that they created Miami, that Miami was like the sort of provincial backwater in the 60s and that they made it into this international, hub, which I think is true.
I think air conditioning helped too. Natural air probably helped.
But many Cubans went to New York, as did my family, where there were many job opportunities. And then in particular, in our case, my mother's older sister, Sylvia, had married a Jewish American man from the Bronx, who was, living in New York, and he had met her in Cuba. They had married and they had come to live in New York before the revolution, right before 59. And so they were already living in New York. And when it was time to leave, it made sense for the family to go to New York, where we had at least one Americano, and he was always called, my Uncle Bill was always called El Americano. So he was the real American. The rest of us were the Cubans. And so he was the real American. And the idea was also, let's go to New York, where we had, a genuine American, to help us get adjusted. So that was what led us to New York, and I think my parents and extended family really love New York, and they really came to feel part of the city and its diversity and its cultures, and have just made a home there. I think in many ways, New York is actually more similar to Havana than Miami is, except for the weather. So in terms of being a city and all that it offers in terms of cultural diversity, I think New York and Havana are very similar. But of course, the weather in Miami is much more like the weather in Cuba. So I think there's an interesting way in which New York and Miami together can create a sense of connection to Cuba.
So interesting. And I've always find it interesting to hear people's family stories of how they ended up where they are. And I think, one of the more fascinating things about this country is that almost everyone has that story, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even people who are indigenous peoples of the Americas, their grandparents were not born in the place where they live necessarily. So there's always a story of moving around that I always find really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So you are an anthropology professor by trade, as it were. I assume you have written anthropology books and articles. And this is a novel for young readers. So I'm wondering, what was the process like as compared to other things that you've written, or just as a process? What did it feel like? What was it like to write a novel?
Well, thanks for the question. I mean, I feel really grateful that I've been able to write a novel. This is my second. My earlier one, which I have here, is Lucky Broken Girl. This was my first one that came out 3 years ago, and now Letters from Cuba that came out now at the end of August. And I've always loved fiction. So I've always read a lot of fiction, and I always dreamed of writing fiction. It's really my favorite genre. What can I say? Letters from Cuba. It was kind of a book that I had to write in it, and it had to be fiction because there was a lot I knew about my grandmother and other immigrants like her, but there was a lot also that I didn't know.
Mm.
And so that's why it's historical fiction. It's based on a lot of research about that period in Cuba and in Europe, and it's based on field work. I've been to Cuba many times. I went and did research in the town where the story takes place in Agramonte, and I have lived in Havana for months at a time. So I really know these places and have really researched them and read books and read history accounts as well. So it's a book that meshes in a way the anthropology with the fiction. So I think that made it a kind of smoother transition in a sense from anthropology to fiction. But I also had to figure out a lot of things that I didn't know. And so that's where the fiction came in. Like I knew my grandmother's story. I'd always heard it, that she was the first of the 7 children to go to Cuba, meet up with my great grandfather, that he wanted to bring one of the sons. And she said, no, let me be first. Even though I'm a girl, I'm going to help you. And I'm the oldest. And by birthright, I should be the one to go first. And she convinced him, and she went first to Cuba. So I knew that story. And I knew a lot about Cuba, and I'd been to Agramonte, and I had all of that, but I didn't know what her day-to-day life was like, and I didn't know what was it like to learn Spanish. We were talking about that earlier. What was it like to go from Yiddish and Polish to speaking Spanish? What was it like to meet Cuban people for the first time? How was she treated in Cuba? Did people welcome her? What did she talk about? So those are the things I didn't know. I didn't know that whole day to day. So that had to be imagined. And that's where the transition to fiction happened. And it was very liberating, actually, to me to write fiction, because as an anthropologist, I always have to base what I write on what I actually heard, what I actually recorded, what people actually said to me. I can't make things up. I have to really stick to what was told to me. And there's a beauty in that, because, you want to be accurate, you want to honor people's words, you want to be respectful. But with fiction, you have this permission to imagine, what was she thinking? What was she feeling? And for example, to just think about, what was it like to arrive, just very sensual kinds of things. What was it like to arrive in Cuba in a woolen dress from Poland, in a woolen dress and woolen stockings? And suddenly you're in this tropical country. It's January, but it's 80 degrees and you're hot. And what did that feel like, to a young person like my grandmother? And so the beauty of fiction is that I could try to imagine all that. I could imagine her taking off her woolen stockings, and she's putting sandals on. She can wear sandals. She can have her legs and her feet out, which she wouldn't have had in Poland, also because of, ideas of modesty and so on. But it's Cuba, and it's hot, and it's tropical. And Papa says, yeah, no, you can go ahead. You can wear sandals. You're in Cuba, So those are all things that I had to imagine. And so with fiction, I just kind of thought about all of that, and thought about, the day to day, thought about experiences and adventures that, a young girl like Esther might have had. And then what I did, to kind of make it easier on myself, is I decided to structure the book as letters. So the whole book is letters. They are letters from Cuba. She's writing these letters to her younger sister, Malka. And that just was so fun for me to do. Like each chapter, we might say, is a letter. And so it allowed me to imagine Esther talking to someone that she really loves, her younger sister, and telling her, well, today this happened, or the other day this happened, or now Papa and I are doing this, or today we had this beautiful experience, or this other day we had this horrible experience. And writing it in letters just allowed the story to flow in a very, very natural way. I didn't feel that I was, in any way pushing the story in a certain direction. It was the story was happening through the letters. And so I think that made it both fun to write and exciting. I didn't know what was going to happen when I would sit down. I would sit down and go, okay, now you just have to, I would say to myself, now you just have to write another letter. And it was kind of a trick. It was like, no, you're not writing a chapter. That's really hard to do. But you can write a letter. Anybody can write a letter. We all write letters. And so I would just sit down and go, okay, here's the next letter. What might have happened next to Esther? And that's how the story grew.
That's so interesting. And I think, the result was really wonderful. It's a great balance of realism, I guess, things that not everything is perfect for Esther, right? Things go wrong that seem believable, but also a lot of things go right, which is, also believable, but also evidence of optimism, I guess, which I found really refreshing. I thought it was a great balance of those kinds of things. So we've reached the end of our time. I want to say thank you, Ruth, for being here. And I'm going to bring Heidi back on to say our official JCC thank you. She's just finishing up with her grandson, I believe. All right, Heidi, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruth, for being with us and for such an interesting Sunday morning. I really enjoyed this discussion. I appreciate your sharing your inspiration and writing the letters and how that made it easier to write. I think that there are probably aspiring writers out there who will find inspiration in that. And I appreciate both of you talking about the J travel trips to Cuba. I went myself when Cuba was just opening up. And I will say that to our audience out there, when we're able to travel again, please join J Travel. At most years, we have 2 trips a year that go to Cuba, and the Jewish community there is so resilient and so delighted when people from other countries come to visit them. It's really a wonderful experience. Thank you all at home for joining us. Our next event is at 11 a.m. today, our book club brunch featuring Michelle Camara, author of Beyond the Ghetto Gates. Remember to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and visit our website, culturalarts.jcc.org/bookfair for our full schedule and ways to get involved. Have a great Sunday.